The morning they fired me, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just that flat grey drizzle that makes everything look like it's already given up. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage for a few extra minutes, finishing my coffee, watching the water streak down the concrete pillar in front of me. I had no idea that was the last normal moment I'd have for a while. I'd been with the company for 12 years. 12 years of 6 a.m. calls with overseas vendors. 12 years of knowing every freight lane, every carrier contract, every customs broker relationship we had. I was the logistics operations manager, though manager is a generous title for someone who is also the analyst, the fixer, the person everyone calls at 11 p.m. when a refrigerated shipment is stuck in Newark and the carrier's dispatcher has stopped answering. I was good at my job. I'm not being arrogant. I was just good at it. The company was a mid-size food distribution business. We supplied specialty and imported goods to grocery chains across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Our biggest contract was with a regional grocery chain. I'll just call them our anchor client, worth about $14 million annually. That relationship ran through me, not officially, but in the way that actually matters, it ran through me. My new director came in 8 months before everything fell apart. I'll call him my new director because that's all he was to me, a title. He came from a tech background, which would have been fine if he'd had any humility about what he didn't know. He didn't. He showed up in February with a new laptop bag and a lot of opinions about process optimization, and within 3 weeks he had reorganized the team structure in a way that made zero operational sense. I tried to explain the carrier relationships. I tried to explain that our agreement with the refrigerated transport company wasn't just a contract, it was years of goodwill and direct lines to specific people who would answer the phone on a Sunday. He listened the way people listen when they've already decided what they think. Head slightly tilted, one hand on the desk, eyes that said, "I'm being patient with you." "We'll standardize everything through the new TMS platform," he said. "That's what it's for." The TMS, the Transportation Management System, had been implemented 6 months before he arrived. I had set it up. I had customized every single workflow, every carrier code, every rate table, every exception rule. The implementation team had spent 8 weeks with me. When they left, they told me I was one of the most thorough clients they'd ever worked with. The system was built around the way our business actually worked, not a generic template. Nobody else on the team had been trained beyond the basics. That wasn't by design. I had asked repeatedly for a second person to go through advanced training with me. My previous director, who retired, had always said yes, and then always had something more urgent come up. When my new director arrived, I brought it up in our first one-on-one. "We'll assess training needs in Q2, he said. Q2 never came. Not for training. What came in Q2 was a Tuesday morning in April where he called me into the small conference room, the one with the broken blind that had been broken since 2019, and my HR business partner was already sitting there. I knew before I sat down, there's something that happens to your body in that moment. Your chest goes very still, not tight, still, like everything is just waiting to see what happens next. He told me they were eliminating my position, restructuring. He said it was nothing personal. He said my contributions had been valued. He did not make eye contact when he said that last part. My HR business partner slid a folder across the table. 4 weeks of severance. A standard release form, a number to call if I had questions about Cobra. I looked at the folder. I looked at my director. I said, "Okay," and I meant it. Not as defeat, not as submission. I just didn't have anything to say to him that was worth saying. I picked up my bag, I shook my HR partner's hand, I did not shake his, and I walked out. I cleaned out my desk in about 20 minutes. A cactus I'd had for 9 years. A framed photo from my sister's wedding that had lived in my bottom drawer. A cardigan I kept for cold days when the AC was too aggressive. My colleague, we'd been close for years. She started the same month I did. Walked me to the elevator without saying anything, which was exactly right. Sometimes the right thing is just to walk someone to the elevator. She hugged me when the doors opened. I drove home in the rain. I made soup. I called my mom. I did not cry until about 9 o'clock that night, and then I cried for maybe 45 minutes, and then I was done. I want to be clear about something. I did not set any of this up. I did not build the system as a trap. I did not create complexity on purpose to make myself indispensable. I had tried to share everything I knew. I had documentation, hundreds of pages of it, living in a shared drive folder I had maintained for years. Carrier contacts, rate negotiation history, escalation paths, the specific preferences of our anchor client's logistics director, who only liked to be called before noon and never on Fridays. All of it was there. I just wasn't there anymore to tell anyone where to look. The first 3 weeks after I was let go, I didn't think about work much. I went to the gym at times I'd never been able to go before. I had lunch with a friend who works downtown. I reorganized my closet. I started applying for positions. Carefully, strategically, because 12 years in one company means your network is deep, but also slightly stale, and I wanted to find something real, not just something fast. My former colleague texted me occasionally. Not about work. She was careful about that. Just checking in, asking about my job search, sending me memes about terrible bosses with no accompanying explanation needed. Then one morning, about 3.5 weeks after I left, she called instead of texting. That was the first sign. I can't say much, she said. But are you available this week? Available how? She paused. The anchor client's logistics director has been calling the main office number. Like, a lot. I let that sit for a second. Is the TMS running? Another pause. Longer. There was an issue with the rate tables last Thursday. And then there was a carrier assignment that went wrong over the weekend. 3 shipments got flagged. I didn't say anything. Nobody knows how to get into the carrier exception workflow, she said. Your director has been in meetings every day. I don't know what they're telling the client. I thanked her and told her I appreciated the call and that she shouldn't risk anything on my account. I meant that. I wasn't going to ask her to put herself in the middle of whatever was happening. I made more coffee and sat at my kitchen table for a while. I want to be honest. I felt something. I won't pretend I didn't. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was more like that feeling when a prediction you didn't want to make turns out to be right. Something between validation and grief, because you'd rather have been wrong. I opened my laptop and looked at job listings for about an hour. Then I closed it and went for a walk. The call from my director's assistant came on a Wednesday. She was professional, a little formal, asked if I had time to speak with him later that afternoon. I said I was available and gave her a window. He called at 4:15. The first 30 seconds were painful to listen to. He started with something about how he hoped my transition was going well, and I waited while he got through it. He was not a man built for this kind of conversation. When he got to the actual point, his voice shifted, tighter, lower, like he was reading from notes he didn't want anyone to see. We've encountered some operational challenges, he said, specifically with the transportation management system configuration and some of the carrier relationships. I see, I said. The anchor client has raised concerns. There are some service-level commitments that... He stopped. Started again. We're looking at potential breach of contract exposure. The client's team is asking questions we don't currently have answers to. I looked out my window. A bird was sitting on my neighbor's fence. Just sitting there. What kind of support were you looking for? I asked. He cleared his throat. We'd like to bring you back in. Consulting capacity. Short term, to stabilize the operations and... What does short term mean? I asked. 6 to 8 weeks. We could offer a consulting rate. What rate? He named a number. It was less than my hourly equivalent had been as a salaried employee. I said, I'll need to think about it. He said, of course, take your time. His voice had that quality of someone who is trying not to sound desperate and is not succeeding. I said I'd be in touch and hung up. I called my sister that night. She's the practical one in our family. She asked 2 questions. Did I have another offer in progress? And did I want the legal headache of going back? I had 1 second-round interview scheduled for the following week. I told her that. Then you have leverage, she said. Figure out what you actually want out of this and ask for it. I thought about what I wanted. Not the money, not the validation. Those felt small. What I wanted was to know that what happened to me would mean something, that the way I'd been walked out of a job I'd given 12 years to would not just be a Tuesday that nobody ever accounted for. The next morning, I called an employment attorney. I'd consulted with her once before, years ago, about something unrelated. She's sharp and direct, and she doesn't waste your time. I laid out the timeline. She listened without interrupting. "A few things," she said when I was done. "The severance agreement you signed, did you sign a non-disparagement clause?" I had. Standard language. Okay, that limits some things but not all. Here's what's interesting. She walked me through it. The fact that my position had been eliminated, but that they were now asking me to return to perform the same work, suggested the elimination might not have been genuine, depending on how they'd handled my departure, specifically whether they'd followed their own internal policies on documentation and process. There might be room to push back on the terms. "I'm not saying you have a slam-dunk case," she said. "I'm saying you have something to negotiate with. If they need you badly enough, use that." I went back to my kitchen table. I wrote down everything I was willing to do and everything I wasn't. I called my director's assistant and asked to schedule a call, not with him alone, but with him and whoever was making the actual decisions. She put me on hold for a long moment, came back, said the company president and the head of finance would be available Thursday morning. Thursday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my notes, my coffee, and 12 years of context that none of them had. The company president opened the call. He was someone I'd had maybe 4 or 5 direct conversations with in my entire tenure, which told you something about how close to the operation the leadership actually was. He was polite, careful, clearly briefed. He explained that they were experiencing significant operational disruption, his words, and that the anchor client had served them a formal notice of concern, which is the step before a breach claim. I asked how many shipments had been affected. He said 11. I had expected maybe 4. 11 shipments over 3 weeks, I said, and the client has issued a formal notice of concern. Yes. What's the contract exposure? A pause. Then the head of finance said, in a careful voice, that the penalty clauses in the anchor client agreement, if triggered, could reach into the mid-6 figures, and that the reputational risk was harder to quantify. But the client's VP of operations had, in the head of finance's words, expressed strong dissatisfaction. I had met that VP 3 times. She was a measured, reasonable person. If she had expressed strong dissatisfaction, things were actually bad. "I want to help you fix this," I said, "and I want to be clear that I have no interest in the company failing or the client relationship collapsing. I know that affects real people." I meant that. My colleagues were still there. But I also want to be honest that I have a second-round interview next Wednesday, and if that goes the way I think it will, I'll have an offer by end of next week. So if we're going to figure out an arrangement, we should do it now. There was a silence on the call. Not uncomfortable, just the silence of people recalibrating. I told them what I needed. I named a consulting day rate, one that was fair and reflected the actual market value of what I was being asked to do. I asked for a written agreement before I set foot in the building. I asked that my engagement be structured as a consulting contract with a defined scope, not as a return to employment. I asked that the agreement explicitly describe the work as stabilization and knowledge transfer. Transfer, because I was not going to spend 6 weeks putting things back together only to have the company right back where they started when I left. Knowledge transfer to whom? The president asked. That's for you to decide, I said. But it needs to be someone who will actually be trained, not someone who will assess training needs in Q2. Nobody said anything for a second. My director was on the call. I knew, though he hadn't spoken. I wasn't looking for him to respond. That line was for the record. The head of finance said they would need to review my terms internally. I said, of course. I said I'd need a response by end of business Friday. I got it Friday at 3 p.m. I walked back into that building on a Monday morning 6 weeks after I'd been walked out. I had a visitor badge, not an employee badge. I want you to understand the difference because I felt it the whole time. I was not there to come back. I was there to do a job I'd already been doing for 12 years, one final time, and to make sure that when I left this time, I left nothing undone. The first week was documentation. I spent 3 days doing nothing but writing. Every workflow, every exception, every contact with their direct number and their backup, and their backup's backup. I recorded screen walkthroughs of every TMS configuration I'd built. I sent everything to a shared folder, and I CC'd the president's assistant on every upload because I was not going to have a situation 6 months later where someone claimed I hadn't handed things over. The second week, I sat with the person they'd assigned as my knowledge transfer partner. She was newer to the company, had been in a different department, had a logistics background from a previous job, was smart and quick, and clearly a little nervous about being thrown into this. I liked her immediately. She asked good questions. She took notes. She didn't pretend to understand things she didn't understand. We went through the carrier relationships together. I called each of the key contacts and introduced her directly. "This is who you'll be working with going forward," I said. Not, "This is my replacement." That's a strange energy to set up. Just, "This is who's here now, and she's solid." The anchor client's logistics director, the one who only liked to be called before noon, I called him on a Wednesday morning. I told him I was transitioning out of the account, but I wanted to introduce him to the team. He was warm, professional, asked me 2 sharp questions about the flagged shipments that I answered directly, and then we spent 20 minutes walking through the corrective actions that were already in progress. By the end of the call, he said, "I appreciate you making this introduction personally." That meant something. The formal notice of concern was withdrawn in week 4. I finished my engagement 2 days ahead of schedule. I didn't linger. My last day, I closed my laptop at 4:30, put it on the desk, said goodbye to the people I wanted to say goodbye to, and walked out the same door I'd walked out 6 weeks earlier. My former colleague walked me out again. We didn't say much. At the elevator, she said, "You know you didn't have to come back." "I know," I said. "Why did you?" The elevator opened. I thought about it for a second. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it right. "Because the work deserved to be finished," I said. "Not for them. For the work." She nodded like she understood. I think she did. That second-round interview did go well. The offer came in the following week, while I was still in my first week of the consulting engagement. I negotiated the start date out by 3 weeks so I could finish what I'd agreed to finish. The new company understood. The role is in supply chain operations for a healthcare distribution company, more complex, better resourced, a team that actually communicates. My new manager asked me in my first week what my biggest professional lesson had been. I told her, document everything, train your backup, and never let your value be invisible just because you're reliable. She laughed like someone who has lived that story herself. My director from the old company, I heard through my former colleague, was moved to a different role about 2 months after I wrapped up my consulting engagement. A lateral move, technically. The kind that means something without anyone having to say it out loud. I don't think about it much, or I try not to. The truth is, I don't think he was a bad person. I think he was someone who had never learned to respect what he couldn't understand, and that's a more common failure than we like to admit. It costs companies millions of dollars, and it costs people like me Tuesday mornings in rooms with broken blinds. The cactus is doing fine, by the way. It's on my windowsill at the new place. 9 years old, and still going. Cacti are harder to get rid of than people think. If there's anything I'd say to someone sitting where I was sitting, in the parking garage, finishing their coffee, not knowing yet, it's this: your knowledge has value, not the abstract, inspirational kind of value, actual, contractual, dollar figure value. Know what it is, document it, train the person next to you, even when your company won't make time for it, not for them, for you. Because the day you walk out, the thing that lets you walk out with your head up is knowing you did the work completely. And if they call you 6 weeks later, know what you're worth before you pick up the phone. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened, not the logistics of it, not the consulting rate or the formal notice of concern or the 11 flagged shipments. The real thing underneath all of it. Here's what I keep coming back to. My director didn't lose because he was cruel. He lost because he made a decision without understanding what he was deciding about. He walked into a room, looked at 12 years of accumulated knowledge and relationship and institutional memory, and saw something interchangeable. Something that could be restructured away on a Tuesday and replaced with a software platform and someone new. He was wrong, but not because he was a bad person. He was wrong because he'd never had to reckon with the cost of not understanding something. Nobody had ever made him pay that price before, and that's the part that stays with me, not the satisfaction of being proven right. That's smaller than people think it is, and it fades faster. What stays is the question of what it actually takes to build something worth keeping. My colleague who walked me to the elevator twice, the anchor client's logistics director who said, "I appreciate you making this introduction personally." The woman I trained in my final weeks, who asked good questions and didn't pretend to understand things she didn't understand. Those relationships didn't happen by accident. They were the result of 12 years of showing up, doing the thing completely, and treating the work like it mattered, because it did. I think we underestimate how much integrity costs in the short term. It would have been easier to let the shipments fail and say nothing. It would have felt justified. But I went back, not for my director, not even for the company, because the work deserved to be finished, and because the people who would have suffered most from a contract collapse weren't the ones who made the decision to fire me. That distinction matters. It's easy to talk about having principles. It's harder to act on them when the person who wronged you is the one who benefits from your decency. What I learned, slowly, and not without some bitterness, is that intelligence without integrity is just efficiency in the wrong direction. My director was capable enough. He understood systems, he understood data. What he didn't understand was that knowledge lives in people, and people are not interchangeable, and the way you treat them on the way out is exactly as important as the way you treated them on the way in. The cactus on my windowsill has been alive for 9 years. It survived my old office, the back of my car, 2 apartments, and a box during a move. Cacti don't need much, but they need the right conditions. And when you give them the wrong ones, they don't make noise about it. They just quietly stop thriving. I think about that sometimes when I'm in my new office with a team that communicates and a manager who asks questions before making decisions. I didn't get here by luck. I got here because I kept doing the work completely, even when the person above me couldn't see it. That's not a moral lesson. That's just what I know to be true. Know what you're worth, finish what you started. And when they call you 6 weeks later, and they will, answer from a position of clarity, not desperation.